Nobody expected the quiet woman who spent her days cleaning rifles in the armory to be the deadliest sniper in military history. But when bullets started flying and trained soldiers couldn't make the shots that mattered, Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez proved that legends don't always wear the uniforms you'd expect. What happened that day in the mountains of Kosovo would rewrite everything the world thought it knew about the woman they'd dismissed as just another support technician. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The crack of Elena's rifle echoed across the ravine like thunder, and 800 meters away, the sniper who'd been systematically eliminating her team dropped silently from his perch. Through her scope, she could see the shock on the faces of the Delta Force operators who'd been pinned down for the last 40 minutes, helpless against an enemy marksman they couldn't locate. Captain Morrison, the team leader who'd spent months treating her like invisible furniture, stared up at her position with his mouth hanging open. How the hell did she make that shot? One of the soldiers whispered into his radio, his voice carrying across the tactical frequency. That's an impossible angle in this wind. Elena didn't respond. She was already tracking the second hostile sniper, the one positioned behind the cluster of boulders near the ridgeline. The enemy shooter had revealed his position by trying to relocate after watching his partner fall. Amateur mistake. Elena had been hunting men like this since before most of these Delta operators had even enlisted. The second shot came 3 seconds later. Another impossible angle, another perfect hit. The mountains fell silent except for the wind whistling through the pine trees. "Overwatch, this is Alpha Team." Captain Morrison's voice crackled through the radio, bewildered and grateful. "Threats neutralized. We're moving to extract the package." Elena remained motionless in her hide, watching through her scope as the elite soldiers below emerged from cover and began their mission. Not one of them looked up toward her position. Not one of them would. Remember, when they filed their after-action reports, that the person who'd saved their lives was the same woman they'd ignored in the armory for the past 8 months. She'd been invisible to them for so long that even now, after demonstrating skills that defied explanation, they couldn't quite process what they'd witnessed. Elena had grown accustomed to being overlooked, dismissed, forgotten. It was easier that way. Safer. The world was more comfortable when legends stayed buried in classified files, where they belonged. But this story didn't begin on that mountain ridge in Kosovo, with Elena proving herself to soldiers who should have known better. It began 14 months earlier in the sterile fluorescent lighting of Forward Operating Base Sentinel, where the most decorated sniper in American military history had been assigned to clean other people's weapons. The morning sun cast long shadows across the compound as Elena walked toward the armory, her boots crunching on the gravel pathway that led between rows of prefabricated buildings. At 34, she moved with the fluid economy of motion that marked career soldiers, but there was something else in her gait, a predatory awareness that most people missed entirely. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, her uniform was perfectly pressed, and her face carried the kind of neutral expression that made people's eyes slide past her without registering her presence. FOB Sentinel was a logistics hub, a place where supplies were sorted, equipment was maintained, and personnel waited for assignments to more glamorous postings. It wasn't the kind of base where heroes were made or legends were born. It was the kind of place where careers went to die quietly, where soldiers counted down their final months before retirement, where the real action happened somewhere else, handled by someone else. Elena had requested the assignment personally, though nobody at Sentinel knew that. Her file listed her as a quartermaster specialist with 15 years of service and an exemplary record in supply chain management. It mentioned her completion of advanced armorer training and her certification in small arms maintenance. What it didn't mention, what had been carefully scrubbed from any database these soldiers might access, was that Elena Vasquez had once been known by a different call sign entirely. The armory occupied the eastern corner of the base, a concrete building that housed everything from standard-issue M4 rifles to specialized sniper systems that most of the soldiers at Sentinel would never be qualified to touch. Elena's official duties were straightforward: inspect incoming weapons, perform routine maintenance, track inventory, and ensure that every piece of equipment met military specifications before being distributed to units in the field. It was mind-numbing work for someone with her background, but Elena found a strange peace in the routine. Strip down a rifle, clean each component with methodical precision, reassemble, test, repeat. The work required no decisions, no split-second calculations, no weighing of lives in the balance. For someone who'd spent years making shots that determined whether missions succeeded or failed, whether teammates lived or died, the simplicity was almost meditative. The other soldiers at Sentinel treated her exactly as her file suggested they should. She was support staff, a technician, someone who kept the machinery running while the real warriors handled the important work. They were polite but distant, acknowledging her presence when necessary, but never quite seeing her as one of them. Elena had engineered this perception carefully, understanding that invisibility was its own form of protection. Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez, who supervised the motor pool, would nod when he passed her in the mess hall. Lieutenant Jennifer Park, the communications officer, might exchange pleasantries about the weather or complain about the coffee. Captain David Morrison, when he bothered to visit the armory at all, would hand over his team's weapons with barely a glance in her direction, assuming she understood her role in the chain of importance. "Just get them cleaned and sighted," he'd said during his first visit, dropping a case of rifles on her workbench like he was depositing laundry. "My boys deploy in 72 hours, and I need everything perfect." Elena had nodded silently, accepting the weapons without comment. She'd noticed immediately that 2 of the rifles had been improperly maintained, their barrels showing signs of copper fouling that would affect accuracy beyond 300 meters. She'd spent 12 hours that night not just cleaning the weapons, but completely rebuilding the bolt assemblies and hand-loading ammunition to match each rifle's specific characteristics. When Morrison's team picked up their equipment, they got weapons that could place rounds within a half-inch grouping at 500 meters, performance that exceeded factory specifications. Morrison never asked how she'd achieved those results. He simply assumed that his equipment was supposed to work that well, that someone somewhere in the supply chain was responsible for ensuring his team had perfect weapons. Elena let him maintain that assumption. It was easier than explaining that she'd spent years learning what separated adequate equipment from tools that could save lives in impossible circumstances. The pattern repeated itself with every unit that passed through Sentinel. Elite soldiers would arrive, drop off their weapons for standard maintenance, and leave with equipment that performed far beyond their expectations. None of them questioned the improvement. They were accustomed to having the best gear available, and they assumed someone else was responsible for making that happen. Elena became part of the background noise of military efficiency, invisible infrastructure that enabled more important people to do more important work. She attended the mandatory briefings, completed her required training, filed her reports, and maintained the careful facade of competent mediocrity that kept her hidden in plain sight. But at night, alone in her quarters, Elena would read the classified after-action reports that arrived through encrypted channels, reports that never mentioned her name but described the performance of weapons she'd personally modified. A Delta Force team in Syria reported unprecedented accuracy during a hostage rescue. Marine snipers in Afghanistan documented shots that should have been impossible with standard equipment. Navy SEALs conducting maritime interdiction operations found their weapons performing with mechanical perfection under the most demanding conditions. Elena read these reports and felt a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with recognition or credit. Somewhere in the world, soldiers were coming home to their families because their weapons didn't fail them when it mattered most. Hostages were walking free because someone's rifle had placed a bullet exactly where it needed to go. Terrorists were stopped because equipment performed beyond its design specifications at the moment when performance meant everything. This was the work she'd chosen, the invisible contribution that let her sleep at night. Elena Vasquez had spent enough years in the spotlight, enough time being the person everyone looked to when impossible shots needed to be made. Now she was content to be the person nobody looked at, whose name appeared on no awards or commendations, whose expertise remained hidden behind the mundane job description of equipment maintenance specialist. But legends have a way of surfacing when the world needs them most, and Elena's carefully constructed anonymity was about to be shattered by circumstances that would force her to become visible again. Forward Operating Base Sentinel operated according to an unspoken but rigid caste system that everyone understood without it ever being officially acknowledged. At the top of this hierarchy sat the operators, the elite soldiers who rotated through the base between deployments to places where real combat happened. Delta Force, Navy SEALs, Marine Force Recon, Army Rangers, these were the men and women who carried themselves with the quiet confidence of people who'd proven themselves under fire. Their conversations in the mess hall carried the weight of authentic experience, peppered with references to operations that existed only in classified files. They spoke in the abbreviated language of professionals who'd learned to communicate essential information with economy and precision. When they walked through the base, other soldiers stepped aside with the unconscious deference reserved for those who'd earned their reputation through violence and survival. Below, the operators in this invisible hierarchy were the conventional soldiers, infantry and armor crews who'd seen combat in the standard theaters of operation. They'd kicked down doors in Iraq, patrolled hostile valleys in Afghanistan, engaged in the grinding warfare that defined modern military operations. These soldiers commanded respect from their peers and subordinates, their combat patches and deployment ribbons serving as visible proof of their membership in the brotherhood of those who'd faced enemy fire. Then came the support specialists, the mechanics and medics and communications technicians who kept the war machine functioning, but rarely pulled triggers in anger. They were essential to military operations, but occupied a secondary tier in the social structure, acknowledged as necessary but not quite warriors in the traditional sense. They ate at different tables, socialized in different groups, and understood their place in the ecosystem of military importance stood at the bottom of this hierarchy. Almost invisible in their insignificance were the logistics personnel, the clerks and supply specialists and equipment maintainers who processed paperwork and managed inventory and performed the thousand mundane tasks that enabled everyone else to focus on more important work. They were the military equivalent of janitors, present but unnoticed, essential but unacknowledged. Elena's position as an armorer placed her solidly in this lowest tier, despite the technical expertise her job required. In the eyes of the operators who passed through Sentinel, she was simply another piece of base infrastructure, no more noteworthy than the generators that provided electricity or the water purification systems that made the base habitable. Her function was to ensure their equipment worked properly, and as long as that happened, her existence required no further consideration. This social stratification revealed itself in countless small interactions throughout each day. When operators entered the mess hall, conversations would pause as other soldiers recognized their presence. Tables would empty as junior personnel made room for their betters. The base commander would personally greet visiting team leaders, ensuring their needs were met with immediate attention. Captain Morrison exemplified this attitude perfectly when he arrived at Sentinel with his 12-man Delta Force team for a week-long equipment refresh and mission planning session. Morrison was a 20-year veteran with deployments to every major conflict zone of the past decade. his chest decorated with ribbons that told the story of a career spent in the most dangerous corners of the world. He carried himself with the unconscious authority of someone accustomed to having his orders followed without question. "Where's the armorer?" he'd asked when he first visited Elena's workshop, speaking to the empty air as if the person he sought might materialize through the force of his expectation. Elena had been standing directly in front of him, but his eyes had scanned past her, as if she were another piece of equipment mounted to the wall. "I'm the armorer," Elena had replied quietly, her voice neutral and professional. Morrison had looked at her then, really looked, and she could see the mental adjustment he made as he reconciled his expectations with reality. He'd been expecting someone else, someone who fit his mental image of what an armorer should look like. A grizzled veteran with grease under his fingernails and stories about weapons he'd maintained in distant wars. Not a compact woman with careful eyes who spoke in the measured tones of someone who chose her words deliberately. "Right," Morrison had said, "recovery smooth but not entirely complete. I need weapons for 12 operators. Full maintenance, sight. Verification, custom loads if necessary. We deploy in 6 days." Elena had nodded, accepting the mission parameters without comment or question. Morrison's tone suggested he expected her to be impressed by the importance of his unit, to understand that serving Delta Force operators was a privilege that elevated her mundane duties to something approaching significance. She'd simply begun cataloging the weapons he presented, making notes about their condition and the modifications that would be required. The other operators treated her with the same casual indifference, acknowledging her presence when they needed to communicate specific requirements, but otherwise behaving as if she were an automated system rather than a person. They would discuss classified operations within earshot of her workbench, secure in the knowledge that someone at her clearance level couldn't possibly understand the significance of what they were planning. Intelligence indicates the targets. Got overwatch positions on 3 sides of the compound, Sergeant First Class Collins had explained to his teammate while Elena worked on their rifles. "We'll need precision fire to neutralize the threats before the assault team can advance." "What's the effective range on these positions?" his partner had asked, examining the scope Elena had just mounted on his weapon. "Longest shots probably 800 meters, maybe 9 if we need to engage from the secondary hide site." Elena had continued her work without visible reaction, though she'd noticed immediately that the scope Collins was examining had been zeroed for exactly that range, with wind correction calculated for the mountainous terrain described in their mission briefing. She'd also hand-loaded their ammunition with powder charges that would deliver optimal performance at extended range, accounting for the temperature and altitude conditions they'd encounter in their area of operations. The soldiers never asked how she'd achieved such precise results with standard military equipment. They assumed that someone, somewhere in the supply chain, was responsible for ensuring their gear performed exactly as needed. Elena was simply the final link in that chain, the person who handed them weapons that had been perfected by others for their specific mission requirements. This assumption of competence without curiosity extended to every aspect of their interaction with support personnel. The base operated smoothly because dozens of specialists like Elena anticipated their needs and solved their problems before they became aware of them. Hot meals appeared on schedule because cooks worked through the night. Communications remained secure because technicians monitored systems around the clock. Vehicles functioned reliably because mechanics performed preventive maintenance that forestalled breakdowns. The operators benefited from this invisible network of expertise while remaining largely oblivious to the knowledge and skill required to maintain it. They saw only the end results, the seamless efficiency that enabled them to focus on their primary mission. The people who made this efficiency possible remained background figures, acknowledged when absolutely necessary but otherwise ignored. Elena understood this dynamic perfectly and had learned to navigate it without attracting unwanted attention. She spoke only when spoken to, provided information in the concise format military personnel preferred, and avoided any behavior that might suggest she possessed knowledge beyond her official job description. When operators discussed tactics or equipment performance, she listened with the apparent attention of someone learning from experts, rather than someone who might have insights of her own. The base's social geography reinforced these hierarchical distinctions through physical separation as much as behavioral cues. Operators occupied the newer barracks with individual rooms and upgraded amenities. They ate at reserved tables in the mess hall and used exclusive briefing rooms for their mission planning. They had access to recreational facilities and communication systems that were off-limits to lower-ranking personnel. Support staff like Elena lived in older, dormitory-style buildings with shared facilities and basic accommodations. They ate whatever remained after the operators and conventional soldiers had made their selections. They used communal computers for personal communication and crowded into multi-purpose rooms for their training sessions and administrative meetings. These physical distinctions served as constant reminders of each person's place in the military hierarchy. Elena walked past the restricted areas every day, understanding that her security clearance and job function placed certain parts of the base beyond her reach. She'd grown accustomed to being excluded from conversations that stopped when she approached, to having doors closed before she could enter rooms where important decisions were being made. But Elena had learned something that her colleagues didn't understand. Invisibility could be its own form of power. When people didn't notice you, they revealed things they'd never share intentionally. When they dismissed your presence, they spoke freely about plans and problems that might otherwise remain secret. When they assumed you lacked the knowledge to understand their conversations, they provided education that no classroom could match. Elena had spent months absorbing information that flowed around her like water around a stone, gathering intelligence about operations and capabilities and weaknesses that no one realized they were sharing. She knew which units were deploying where, which missions had succeeded or failed, which equipment had performed beyond expectations, and which had failed at critical moments. This knowledge remained locked away in her memory, filed alongside skills and experiences that her official record didn't reflect. Elena had become a repository of institutional knowledge that exceeded the combined experience of most of the operators who passed through Sentinel, though none of them would ever suspect that the quiet woman who maintained their weapons possessed such comprehensive understanding of their profession. The hierarchy that kept her invisible also kept her safe, allowing her to observe and learn without the burden of leadership or the risk of exposure. Elena had found peace in this anonymity, content to contribute to the war effort through invisible excellence rather than visible heroism. But peace, Elena had learned during her years of service, was always temporary in military life. Elena Vasquez had arrived at Forward Operating Base Sentinel, carrying a single duffel bag and a personnel file that told a carefully constructed story about 15 years of unremarkable military service. According to her official records, she'd spent her career in logistics assignments across a dozen different bases, accumulating the steady progression of rank and responsibility that marked competent but unexceptional soldiers. Her fitness reports described her as reliable, detail-oriented, and professional, the kind of evaluations that ensured continued employment without attracting special attention. What made Elena an outsider at Sentinel wasn't her gender, though she was one of only 6 women assigned to the base. It wasn't her ethnicity, though her Mexican-American heritage set her apart from the predominantly white operators who rotated through the facility. It wasn't even her age, though at 34 she was older than many of the conventional soldiers and younger than most of the senior specialists who formed the base's permanent cadre. Elena's outsider status came from something more subtle and more profound. She didn't fit into any of the established categories that defined military identity at a place like Sentinel. She wasn't an operator with combat decorations and deployment ribbons. She wasn't a conventional soldier with infantry experience and warrior credentials. She wasn't even a typical support specialist with deep technical knowledge in a specific field that others respected. Instead, Elena occupied a strange middle ground that made her colleagues uncomfortable in ways they couldn't articulate. Her military bearing was too precise for someone who'd supposedly spent her career in supply warehouses. Her situational awareness was too acute for a logistics specialist who'd never served in combat zones. Her knowledge of weapon systems was too comprehensive for an armorer whose experience should have been limited to maintenance procedures. These inconsistencies created a low-level cognitive dissonance in the people who interacted with her regularly. They sensed something that didn't align with their expectations, but they couldn't identify what made Elena different from other support personnel they'd encountered. The easiest solution was to dismiss these impressions as irrelevant, to focus on her official function while ignoring the subtle details that suggested a more complex background. Sergeant First Class Williams, who supervised the base motor pool, noticed that Elena moved through the compound with the predatory alertness of someone scanning for threats. "She walks like infantry," he'd mentioned to his assistant one afternoon, watching Elena cross the open area between buildings. "But her file says she's never been assigned to a combat unit." Williams had served with enough soldiers to recognize the unconscious habits that combat experience ingrained in people. The way Elena's eyes constantly swept her surroundings, cataloging potential cover and escape routes. The way she positioned herself in rooms to maintain clear sightlines to exits. The way she paused at doorways and corners, listening for sounds that might indicate danger. These behaviors were automatic responses that developed through exposure to environments where carelessness could prove fatal. They weren't skills that logistics specialists typically acquired during routine assignments to secure bases in friendly territory. But when Williams mentioned his observations to other NCOs, they shrugged and changed the subject. Elena's walking patterns were irrelevant to her job performance, and job performance was the only metric that mattered in their evaluation of support personnel. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez, the base executive officer, had similar experiences. When she tried to place Elena within the familiar framework she used to understand her subordinates, Martinez prided herself on her ability to read people, to identify the experiences and motivations that shaped their behavior. But Elena presented no clear indicators of her background or aspirations. During their initial interview, Martinez had asked Elena about her career goals and personal interests, expecting responses that would reveal something about her character and competence. Elena's answers had been professionally appropriate, but strangely uninformative. She expressed satisfaction with her current assignment and described her duties with technical precision that suggested genuine expertise. When pressed about her previous experience, she provided accurate but minimal information that satisfied the requirements of the conversation without revealing anything meaningful about her background. "She's competent," Martinez had noted in Elena's personnel file, "but difficult to evaluate beyond basic job performance. Recommend standard assignment with routine monitoring." This assessment reflected Martinez's frustration with Elena's opacity as much as her professional capabilities. Most soldiers revealed themselves through their speech patterns, their choice of recreational activities, their responses to routine questions about their service history. Elena managed to participate in these conversations without providing any real insight into who she was or what had shaped her military experience. The other support specialists at Sentinel found Elena equally difficult to categorize. Technical Sergeant Robert Kim, who managed the base communication systems, had tried to engage Elena in conversations about their shared experience with military technology. Kim enjoyed discussing the evolution of equipment and procedures, sharing war stories about systems that had failed at critical moments or performed beyond specifications under extreme conditions. Elena listened to these conversations with polite attention, occasionally asking informed questions that demonstrated her understanding of the technical concepts involved. But she never contributed her own stories or experiences, never revealed whether she'd encountered similar situations during her own career. Her responses were appropriate and intelligent, but they provided no window into her personal history with the equipment and procedures they discussed. She knows her stuff, Kim had told his colleagues, but she keeps it all professional. Never talks about where she learned what she knows or what kind of situations she's been in. This pattern of knowledgeable but impersonal interaction characterized all of Elena's relationships at Sentinel. She was friendly without being familiar, helpful without being intrusive, competent without being boastful. She participated in the social rituals that maintained unit cohesion while revealing nothing about her inner thoughts or past experiences. The younger soldiers initially tried to include Elena in their off-duty activities, inviting her to join them for movies in the recreation center or informal gatherings in the dormitory common areas. Elena would decline these invitations politely, explaining that she preferred to spend her free time reading or maintaining her personal equipment. Her refusals were never rude or dismissive, but they established clear boundaries between her public role and her private life. Over time, these boundaries became accepted aspects of Elena's personality. She was known as someone who kept to herself, who was pleasant enough during working hours, but who didn't seek social interaction beyond what military courtesy required. The younger soldiers stopped including her in their invitations, not from any sense of rejection, but from understanding that Elena simply operated according to different social preferences. This isolation might have seemed lonely to outside observers, but Elena had chosen it deliberately. She'd learned through hard experience that maintaining distance from colleagues was safer than allowing them to become too familiar with her background or capabilities. Close relationships invited questions that she couldn't answer honestly, and honest answers would compromise the carefully constructed identity that allowed her to remain invisible. Elena's living quarters reflected the same careful neutrality that characterized her professional relationships. Her assigned room in the support staff dormitory contained the standard military furnishings and none of the personal touches that usually made such spaces habitable. No photographs of family or friends, no souvenirs from previous assignments, no books or magazines that might reveal her interests or background. The single exception was a locked footlocker that contained items she'd accumulated during 15 years of military service. But even this container held only the most innocuous possessions, spare uniforms, basic toiletries, official documents that any soldier might be expected to maintain. Anyone searching Elena's quarters would find nothing that contradicted her official personnel record or suggested capabilities beyond those required for her current assignment. Elena had become expert at living in plain sight while remaining fundamentally invisible. She attended mandatory formations and training sessions, completed required documentation, participated in base maintenance activities, and fulfilled every obligation of military service without attracting attention or curiosity. Her performance evaluations were consistently positive, her disciplinary record was spotless, and her medical file showed no issues that might affect her duty status. But beneath this facade of bureaucratic normalcy, Elena maintained skills and knowledge that would have shocked anyone who thought they understood her capabilities. She continued training regimens that had nothing to do with her official duties, practicing techniques that logistics specialists weren't expected to master. She monitored global military operations through classified channels that her security clearance shouldn't have provided access to. She maintained contacts within the special operations community who knew her by different names and call signs that didn't appear in any personnel database at Sentinel. These activities remained completely separate from her public role as an equipment maintenance specialist. Elena had learned to compartmentalize her life so thoroughly that even she sometimes forgot which version of herself she was supposed to be at any given moment. The woman who cleaned rifles and calibrated scopes during duty hours was different from the person who emerged in her private moments, when she allowed herself to remember experiences that her official record insisted had never happened. This carefully maintained duality was about to be tested by circumstances that would make it impossible for Elena to remain invisible any longer. Master Sergeant Thomas Kellner had been the senior enlisted logistics supervisor at Forward Operating Base Sentinel for 18 months. And in that time he developed an unshakable conviction that every person under his command should fit into clearly defined categories that he could understand and control. Kellner was a 24-year veteran who'd built his reputation on running efficient operations through strict adherence to regulations and an almost obsessive attention to detail that left no room for ambiguity or deviation from established procedures. At 45, Kellner possessed the weathered appearance of a career soldier who'd spent decades in the harsh environments where the military conducted its business. His uniform was always perfectly pressed, his boots maintained to a mirror shine, and his bearing projected the kind of authoritative competence that younger soldiers found both inspiring and intimidating. He'd earned his position through consistent performance and an ability to manage complex logistics operations under pressure, skills that made him invaluable to base commanders who needed someone capable of keeping their facilities running smoothly. But Kellner's greatest strength was also his most significant weakness, his need to maintain absolute control over every aspect of his domain. He approached military logistics like a chess master, viewing each subordinate as a piece with specific capabilities and limitations that could be deployed according to predetermined strategies. This systematic approach had served him well throughout his career, allowing him to optimize resource allocation and personnel management in ways that consistently exceeded performance standards. Elena Vasquez represented a problem that Kellner couldn't solve using his traditional methods. From the moment she'd arrived at Sentinel, she'd defied his attempts to categorize her within the organizational frameworks he used to understand his personnel. Her official record suggested she should be a routine logistics specialist, competent but unremarkable, someone who could be assigned standard tasks and managed through conventional supervisory techniques. Instead, Elena displayed capabilities and knowledge that didn't align with her documented experience, creating cognitive dissonance. That made Kellner increasingly uncomfortable with her presence in his organization. He'd spent months trying to reconcile the contradiction between Elena's supposed background and her actual performance, growing more frustrated as the evidence accumulated. Something about her official record was incomplete or inaccurate. First incident that caught Kellner's attention had occurred during Elena's third week at Sentinel, when Captain Morrison's Delta Force team had retrieved their weapons after routine maintenance. Kellner had been conducting a spot inspection of the armory when Morrison mentioned that his team's rifles were performing with exceptional accuracy, grouping shots at ranges that exceeded the weapon's normal specifications. "Your armorer did outstanding work," Morrison had told Kellner, examining one of the modified weapons with professional appreciation. "I've never seen standard issue equipment perform at this level. Whatever modifications she made, they're exactly what we needed for our mission parameters." Kellner had nodded and accepted the compliment, but internally he'd been puzzled by Morrison's assessment. Elena's personnel file indicated she'd completed basic armorer training, but nothing in her background suggested she possessed the advanced technical knowledge required to improve weapon performance beyond factory specifications. The modifications Morrison described required expertise that took years to develop, along with access to specialized tools and techniques that weren't typically available at Forward Operating Bases. When Kellner had questioned Elena about her methods, she'd provided technically accurate but vague explanations that satisfied the requirements of his inquiry, without revealing how she'd acquired such sophisticated knowledge. She'd spoken about barrel harmonics and ammunition, matching with the casual fluency of someone who understood these concepts deeply. But she deflected his attempts to probe the sources of her expertise. I read the technical manuals thoroughly. Elena had explained when Kellner asked about her approach to weapon modification. The procedures are all documented if you know where to look for them. This response had been professionally appropriate, but ultimately unsatisfying. Kellner had read the same technical manuals, and they contained nothing that would enable a typical armorer to achieve the performance improvements that Morrison's team had experienced. Elena's explanation was technically true but fundamentally incomplete, a pattern that began to characterize all of her interactions with his supervision. Over the following months, Kellner had documented a series of similar incidents that reinforced his suspicions about Elena's background. Supply requisitions that demonstrated knowledge of specialized equipment she shouldn't have been familiar with. Maintenance procedures that exceeded standard protocols in ways that suggested advanced training. Casual references to tactical concepts that logistics specialists weren't expected to understand. Each individual incident could be explained away as coincidence or exceptional dedication to professional development. But collectively, they painted a picture of someone whose actual capabilities far exceeded what her official record indicated. Kellner began to suspect that Elena was either misrepresenting her qualifications or operating under some form of classified assignment that her supervisors weren't authorized to know about. Either possibility represented a challenge to Kellner's authority and a threat to the organizational control he'd worked years to establish. If Elena was lying about her background, she was potentially compromising base security by concealing relevant information from her chain of command. If she was operating under classified orders, she was undermining his ability to manage his personnel effectively by maintaining secrets that affected their operational capabilities. Kellner's response was to intensify his supervision of Elena's activities, looking for evidence that would either expose her deception or force her to reveal the true nature of her assignment. He began conducting unannounced inspections of her work area, examining her equipment for unauthorized modifications or evidence of activities beyond her stated responsibilities. He required detailed written reports for routine tasks that other personnel were allowed to complete without documentation. He assigned her additional duties that would test the limits of her knowledge and reveal whether she possessed capabilities that her file didn't reflect. Elena had responded to this increased scrutiny with the same professional composure she displayed in all her military interactions. She completed Kellner's additional requirements without complaint, provided the requested documentation with meticulous attention to detail, and submitted to his inspections with polite cooperation. But her compliance only intensified Kellner's suspicions, because her responses demonstrated familiarity with administrative procedures that suggested broader military experience than her record indicated. "She knows too much," Kellner had confided to Sergeant First Class Williams during one of their weekly supervisory meetings. "Nobody spends 15 years in supply warehouses and comes out knowing what she knows about weapon systems and tactical procedures." Williams had nodded diplomatically but seemed reluctant to pursue Kellner's concerns. Like most of the NCOs at Sentinel, Williams preferred to focus on job performance rather than background investigations, and Elena's work quality was consistently excellent. As long as she completed her assigned tasks competently and didn't create problems for other personnel, Williams saw no reason to question the credentials that had gotten her assigned to the base. But Kellner couldn't let the matter rest. His military training had taught him that anomalies in personnel records often indicated security risks, and his personal psychology demanded explanations for inconsistencies that challenged his understanding of his organization. He began making informal inquiries about Elena's previous assignments, contacting colleagues at bases where she'd supposedly served to verify the experiences described in her file. These inquiries produced frustrating results that deepened Kellner's suspicions rather than resolving them. Several of Elena's supposed former supervisors had no clear recollection of her service, despite personnel records that indicated she'd worked for them for months or years. Others remembered her only vaguely, describing her as competent but unremarkable in ways that seemed inconsistent with the capabilities she'd demonstrated at Sentinel. The pattern suggested either a remarkably forgettable personality or systematic efforts to minimize her visibility in official records. Neither explanation satisfied Kellner's need for clarity about Elena's background and qualifications. He became increasingly convinced that Elena was concealing information that could compromise base security or operational effectiveness. Kellner's investigation expanded to include surveillance of Elena's off-duty activities, looking for evidence of unauthorized communications or behaviors that might reveal her true purpose at Sentinel. He assigned junior personnel to monitor her interactions with other soldiers, hoping to identify conversations that might provide insight into her real background or mission. He reviewed her computer usage logs and communication records, searching for patterns that might indicate classified activities or external contacts. The systematic harassment began to affect Elena's daily routine in ways that other base personnel couldn't help but notice. Her work area was inspected multiple times per week, disrupting her maintenance schedules and forcing her to spend additional time documenting routine procedures. She was required to attend supervisory meetings that served no apparent purpose, beyond allowing Kellner to ask probing questions about her methods and experience. Her requests for supplies or equipment were subjected to unusual scrutiny that delayed completion of time-sensitive tasks. The other support specialists at Sentinel observed Kellner's treatment of Elena with growing discomfort, recognizing that she was being subjected to a level of supervision that exceeded normal administrative oversight. But military hierarchy prevented them from questioning Kellner's methods directly, and Elena's own refusal to complain about her treatment made it difficult for colleagues to offer support or intervention. Elena understood that Kellner's harassment was escalating towards some form of confrontation that would force her to choose between maintaining her cover and protecting her position at Sentinel. She could see the trap he was constructing, the systematic accumulation of evidence that would eventually justify more aggressive action against her. But she also knew that any attempt to defend herself would require revelations about her background that would compromise the carefully constructed identity that kept her safe. The stakes of this conflict extended far beyond Elena's individual comfort or career prospects. Her assignment to Sentinel served purposes that Kellner couldn't understand, and exposure of her true background would have consequences that reached far beyond the boundaries of a single forward operating base. Kellner's relentless investigation was about to uncover secrets that the military establishment had spent years protecting, and Elena was running out of options for avoiding the confrontation that would force her to reveal who she really was. The first hint that Elena Vasquez carried secrets beyond her official record came not from any dramatic revelation, but from the way she handled a damaged rifle that arrived in her workshop on a Tuesday morning in late September. The weapon belonged to a Marine Force reconnaissance team that had been conducting operations in the mountains of northern Afghanistan, and it bore the unmistakable scars of combat: a cracked stock, sand embedded in the action, and a scope that had been knocked completely out of alignment by what appeared to be shrapnel damage. Corporal Jackson Martinez, the team's designated marksman, had delivered the rifle personally, explaining that it had been damaged during a firefight that had lasted most of the previous night. IED took out our vehicle, he'd told Elena, setting the weapon carefully on her workbench. This thing got thrown around pretty good, but it still fired when we needed it to. Think you can get it back to spec? Elena had examined the rifle with the methodical thoroughness that characterized all her work, running her hands along the stock to assess the structural damage and peering through the action to evaluate the internal components. But as she'd worked, Martinez had noticed something unusual about her approach. Most armorers would have begun by consulting technical manuals and diagnostic checklists, following established procedures to identify and catalog the damage. Elena, however, had seemed to diagnose the weapon's problems through touch and instinct, her fingers finding stress points and mechanical issues that weren't visible to casual inspection. "You've seen this kind of damage before," Martinez had observed, watching Elena manipulate the rifle's components with practiced familiarity. It hadn't been a question but a statement, delivered with the curiosity of someone who recognized expertise. When he encountered it, Elena had paused in her examination, aware that her diagnostic methods had revealed more about her background than she'd intended. "Equipment gets damaged in the field," she'd replied carefully. "You learn to recognize the patterns after a while." But Martinez hadn't been satisfied with this explanation. He'd spent 4 years as a designated marksman with force reconnaissance, and he'd worked with enough armorers to recognize the difference between theoretical knowledge and hands-on experience. Elena's assessment of his rifle demonstrated familiarity with combat damage that suggested direct exposure to battlefield conditions, not the second-hand knowledge that support personnel typically acquired through training and documentation. "Most armorers I've worked with need to strip a weapon completely before they can tell what's wrong with it," Martinez had continued, his tone neutral but probing. "You spotted 3 separate issues just from handling it for a few minutes." Elena had resumed her work without responding, but Martinez's observation had been accurate. She'd identified stress fractures in the barrel extension, detected timing issues in the bolt mechanism, and recognized signs of gas system contamination that would affect the weapon's reliability under sustained fire. These diagnoses required experience with weapons that had been subjected to the extreme stresses of combat, knowledge that logistics specialists weren't expected to possess. After Martinez had left, Elena had found herself thinking about the careful balance she maintained between competence and invisibility. Each demonstration of her actual capabilities risked exposure, but deliberate incompetence would compromise the quality of work that kept soldiers alive in dangerous situations. She'd learned to walk this line with meticulous precision, revealing just enough expertise to perform her duties effectively while concealing the depth of knowledge that would invite uncomfortable questions. The rifle repair had taken Elena 3 days to complete, not because the damage was extensive, but because she'd chosen to rebuild the weapon to specifications that exceeded its original factory performance. She'd hand-fitted replacement components to tolerances that eliminated mechanical inconsistencies, modified the gas system to function reliably under extreme environmental conditions, and calibrated the scope with precision that would maintain accuracy across temperature and altitude variations that the Marines might encounter in their operational area. When Martinez had returned to collect his weapon, Elena had handed him documentation that described the repairs in standard technical language, listing replaced parts and completed procedures without mentioning the improvements she'd made to the rifle's fundamental performance characteristics. Martinez had signed the paperwork and departed without testing the weapon, trusting that Elena had restored it to functional condition. But 3 weeks later, Martinez had returned to Elena's workshop with a puzzled expression and a question that indicated her modifications hadn't gone unnoticed. "That rifle you repaired," he'd begun, leaning against her workbench with the casual posture of someone initiating a significant conversation. "It's performing differently than it did before the damage." Elena had looked up from the pistol she'd been cleaning, her expression carefully neutral. "Different how?" "Better," Martinez had replied bluntly. "Tighter groups, more consistent trajectory, better reliability under rapid fire conditions. It's like you rebuilt it to better specifications than it originally had." This observation had been both compliment and challenge, acknowledging Elena's skill while questioning the source of capabilities that her job description didn't account for. Martinez wasn't accusing her of anything inappropriate, but he was clearly curious about how a logistics specialist had managed to improve her precision weapons performance beyond its design parameters. Elena had chosen her response carefully, understanding that Martinez's question could be the beginning of broader scrutiny of her methods and background. Sometimes repairs provide opportunities for improvements, she'd said, returning her attention to the pistol in her hands, if you know what to look for. But Martinez hadn't been deterred by her deflection. Where did you learn to know what to look for? He'd asked directly. Because what you did to that rifle requires knowledge that most armorers don't have. The question had hung in the air between them, carrying implications that extended beyond casual curiosity about technical procedures. Martinez was a professional soldier with enough experience to recognize when someone's capabilities exceeded their official qualifications, and his inquiry suggested he'd begun to suspect that Elena's background was more complex than her personnel. File indicated Elena had been saved from the need to respond by the arrival of other Marines who'd come to collect their equipment, ending the conversation before she'd been forced to provide explanations that would either expose her secrets or reveal her evasiveness. But Martinez's scrutiny had served as a warning that her careful performance of bureaucratic mediocrity wasn't as convincing as she'd hoped. The incident had reminded Elena of lessons learned years earlier from someone whose name she could never mention at a place like Sentinel, someone who'd taught her that true expertise couldn't be completely hidden from those who possessed the knowledge to recognize it. Skills have signatures, Colonel Sarah Chun had told her during training. That officially had never occurred. You can mask your capabilities, but you can't eliminate the traces they leave. Someone with the right background will always be able to see what you're trying to hide. Chun had been Elena's mentor during a period of her career that existed only in classified files that bore no relation to her current assignment. A decorated sniper with over 200 confirmed eliminations across 3 decades of special operations, Chun had recognized Elena's potential when others had dismissed her as another logistics specialist seeking advancement through specialized training programs. You have the intuition, Chun had observed during Elena's first week at the facility, that didn't appear on any military maps. Most snipers can be trained to make difficult shots under controlled conditions. But combat sniping requires the ability to synthesize dozens of variables instantly, to recognize patterns that aren't visible to analytical thinking. You process information differently than other people do. Elena's training under Chun had lasted 18 months and covered skills that extended far beyond marksmanship. Advanced ballistics calculations that accounted for atmospheric conditions most shooters never encountered. Fieldcraft techniques that enabled long-term concealment in hostile territory. Target identification methods that distinguished legitimate military objectives from protected personnel under the complex rules of engagement that governed modern warfare. But more importantly, Chun had taught Elena how to remain invisible within military bureaucracy, how to maintain classified capabilities, while serving in conventional assignments that provided cover for operations that officially didn't exist. The best operators are the ones nobody notices, Chun had explained. When you're invisible, you're safe. When you're safe, you can do work that matters without interference from people who wouldn't understand its importance. Elena's assignment to Sentinel represented the practical application of Chun's teachings, a way to contribute to military operations while remaining protected by the anonymity that her official record provided. But Martinez's recognition of her capabilities suggested that even careful concealment had limits when dealing with professionals who possessed sufficient experience to recognize expertise, regardless of its official classification. The rifle repair had been only the first in a series of incidents that gradually eroded Elena's carefully maintained invisibility. A week after Martinez's inquiry, Technical Sergeant Kim had mentioned that communications equipment Elena had repaired was performing with unusual reliability, maintaining signal clarity under atmospheric conditions that typically degraded radio transmissions. 2 weeks later, Lieutenant Park had commented on modifications Elena had made to her sidearm Improvements that enhanced accuracy and reduced maintenance requirements beyond what standard procedures could achieve. Each incident individually could be dismissed as coincidence or exceptional dedication to technical excellence. But collectively, they created a pattern that suggested Elena possessed knowledge and experience that her official background couldn't account for. She was becoming visible in ways that threatened the security that anonymity provided, drawing attention from colleagues who were beginning to question the contradiction between her supposed qualifications and her actual performance. Elena understood that her situation was becoming increasingly precarious. The accumulation of evidence regarding her capabilities would eventually reach a threshold that made continued concealment impossible. When that happened, she would be forced to choose between maintaining her cover and revealing abilities that would compromise the carefully constructed identity that kept her protected. But Elena also knew something that her colleagues at Sentinel couldn't understand. Her true background was about to become relevant in ways that would make concealment impossible regardless of her personal preferences. Intelligence reports that she monitored through channels her security clearance shouldn't have provided access to indicated that the relative peace of Forward Operating Base Sentinel was about to be shattered by events that would require capabilities nobody expected her to possess. The time for hiding was drawing to a close, and Elena Vasquez was about to discover whether the training that officially had never happened would be sufficient to protect the soldiers, who had no idea they were about to need her help. The psychological pressure began subtly manifesting. First in the way conversations stopped when Elena entered rooms where her colleagues had been discussing their work. She'd noticed the sudden silence, the awkward pause as soldiers searched for neutral topics that wouldn't reveal what they'd been talking about before her arrival. These moments of uncomfortable quiet stretched longer each day, creating an atmosphere of suspicion that made even routine interactions feel charged with unspoken tension. Master Sergeant Kellner's investigation had created ripple effects throughout the support staff community at Sentinel, as other NCOs found themselves questioning whether they really knew the people working under their supervision. Elena could sense the shift in how her colleagues regarded her, the way their eyes lingered when they thought she wasn't looking, the subtle changes in their body language that indicated their growing unease with her presence. Technical Sergeant Kim had been the first to modify his behavior noticeably, becoming formal and distant during interactions that had previously been friendly and professional. Where he'd once engaged Elena in casual technical discussions about equipment maintenance and system performance, he now limited their conversations to essential work-related communications delivered in clipped, official tones that suggested he was documenting their exchanges for future reference. "I need the communications array tested and returned to service by 1400 hours, Kim had informed Elena during their last significant interaction, speaking with the rigid formality of someone reading from a prepared script. Standard diagnostic procedures should be sufficient. Document any anomalies in the maintenance log. Elena had nodded and accepted the assignment without comment, but she'd recognized the change in Kim's approach immediately. His instructions contained none of the technical nuance that had characterized their previous collaborations, and his emphasis on standard procedures seemed designed to limit her ability to demonstrate the advanced capabilities that had made her repairs so effective. Kim was protecting himself from association with Elena's suspicious competence, creating official distance that would insulate him from whatever consequences Kellner's investigation might produce. Similar patterns emerged in Elena's interactions with other base personnel over the following weeks. Sergeant Rodriguez, who supervised the motor pool, began assigning her routine tasks that required minimal technical knowledge, despite her demonstrated expertise with complex mechanical systems. Lieutenant Park stopped requesting Elena's assistance with her personal weapons maintenance, choosing instead to perform these tasks herself or seek help from other armorers whose capabilities were less ambiguous. Even the junior enlisted soldiers, who'd previously treated Elena with casual familiarity, began to maintain careful professional distance, understanding through military instinct that someone under investigation by senior NCOs was potentially dangerous to associate with. They continued to acknowledge her presence with appropriate military courtesy, but the easy camaraderie that had once characterized their interactions was replaced by the wary politeness that soldiers used when dealing with people whose status within the organization was uncertain. Elena found herself eating alone in the mess hall, occupying tables that other soldiers avoided not through deliberate snubbing, but through the unconscious social navigation that kept military personnel away from potentially controversial associations. She'd become invisible again, but this time her invisibility carried the weight of suspicion rather than the protection of anonymity. The isolation extended beyond social interactions to affect Elena's professional duties in ways that made her work increasingly difficult to complete effectively. Supply requests that had previously been processed routinely now required additional documentation and justification, forcing Elena to spend hours explaining why she needed specialized components that other armorers were allowed to requisition without question. Equipment that had been readily available for her use was suddenly subject to scheduling conflicts and administrative delays that prevented her from accessing tools essential for maintaining the performance standards that had distinguished her work. Kellner's systematic harassment had evolved into a campaign of administrative sabotage designed to create conditions where Elena would either be forced to reveal her true capabilities or accept professional failure that would justify her removal from the base. He scheduled mandatory training sessions during times when Elena had critical deadlines to meet, forcing her to choose between attending required activities and completing time-sensitive repairs for units preparing to deploy. He reassigned personnel who'd been supporting Elena's work, leaving her to handle increased workloads without the assistance that made complex maintenance tasks manageable. The most insidious aspect of Kellner's campaign was the way it created situations where Elena's refusal to demonstrate her full capabilities began to compromise the quality of her work. When Captain Morrison's Delta Force team submitted weapons for pre-deployment maintenance, Kellner had imposed restrictions that prevented Elena from performing the modifications that had made their previous equipment so effective. She was limited to basic cleaning and inspection procedures that met minimum military standards but fell far short of the performance optimization that she could have provided. Elena had been forced to watch Morrison's team depart for their mission, carrying weapons that functioned adequately but lacked the precision that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The knowledge that she could have provided these soldiers with equipment that might save their lives, but had been prevented from doing so by administrative interference, created a form of moral pressure that traditional harassment couldn't match. She began to understand that Kellner's investigation wasn't just about satisfying his curiosity regarding her background or asserting his authority over subordinate personnel. He was systematically creating conditions that would force Elena to choose between maintaining her cover and fulfilling the obligations that had brought her to Sentinel in the first place. The irony was devastating. The more effectively Kellner isolated her from routine military duties, the more likely it became that circumstances would arise requiring capabilities that only Elena possessed. The pressure intensified when Elena received notification that her security clearance was being reviewed as part of a routine administrative process that everyone understood was anything but routine. The investigation would require detailed interviews about her background and experience, examinations of her personal relationships and financial records, and psychological evaluations designed to identify inconsistencies between her official record and her actual history. Elena knew that her clearance review was directly connected to Kellner's investigation, another tool in his systematic effort to expose whatever secrets he suspected she was hiding. The process would place her under the kind of scrutiny that her carefully constructed identity couldn't withstand, particularly if investigators began comparing her documented assignments with the recollections of personnel who were supposed to have supervised her during those periods. But the clearance review also represented a potential opportunity. If Elena could navigate the investigation successfully, the official endorsement of her background would effectively end Kellner's harassment and restore her ability to perform her duties without constant interference. The challenge was surviving the process without revealing information that would compromise operations extending far beyond her individual assignment at Sentinel. Elena's nights became exercises in careful preparation as she reviewed every aspect of her official record, memorizing details about assignments that had never happened and supervisors she'd never worked for, preparing responses to questions that would test her ability to maintain fictional narratives under professional interrogation. She practiced explaining technical knowledge in ways that suggested routine training rather than specialized experience, crafting explanations for her capabilities that would satisfy investigators without revealing their true origins. The psychological toll of maintaining multiple versions of reality began to affect Elena's daily performance in subtle but noticeable ways. She found herself hesitating before responding to routine questions, double-checking her answers to ensure she was providing information consistent with her official background rather than her actual experience. Colleagues who'd grown accustomed to Elena's confident professionalism began to notice moments of uncertainty that seemed uncharacteristic for someone with her demonstrated competence. These small inconsistencies in Elena's behavior provided additional ammunition for Kellner's campaign against her, evidence that she was concealing information that created stress when she was required to maintain fictional accounts of her military service. He began scheduling unannounced meetings with Elena, ostensibly to discuss routine administrative matters but actually to observe her responses to unexpected questions that might reveal cracks in her carefully constructed facade. Your performance evaluations from Fort Benning show some interesting patterns, Kellner had mentioned during one of these sessions, referring to documents that Elena knew contained fabricated information designed to support her cover story. Your supervisors noted exceptional attention to detail, but seemed surprised by some of your technical insights. Care to explain how you developed such advanced knowledge during what was supposed to be a basic assignment? Elena had provided rehearsed explanations about self-directed study and exceptional dedication to professional development, responses that were technically plausible but felt hollow when delivered under Kellner's skeptical scrutiny. She could see that he wasn't convinced by her answers, but she also knew that he lacked the evidence necessary to challenge her official record directly. The standoff between Elena and Kellner had reached a stalemate, where neither could achieve their objectives without taking risks that might prove professionally devastating. Kellner couldn't expose Elena's deception without concrete proof that she was misrepresenting her qualifications, but Elena couldn't demonstrate her actual capabilities without confirming Kellner's suspicions about her background. Meanwhile, intelligence reports that Elena monitored through classified channels indicated that the strategic situation in the region was deteriorating rapidly. Hostile forces were consolidating positions in the mountains surrounding Sentinel, and reconnaissance indicated preparation for operations that would threaten the base's security within weeks rather than months. The peaceful isolation that had made Sentinel an ideal assignment for someone seeking anonymity was about to be shattered by combat operations that would test every person on the base. Elena understood that the approaching crisis would resolve her conflict with Kellner in ways that neither of them currently anticipated. When the shooting started, questions about her background would become irrelevant compared to her ability to keep soldiers alive under fire. But she also knew that survival would require capabilities that would make further concealment of her true identity impossible. The time for hiding was running out, and Elena Vasquez was about to discover whether the training that had shaped her into someone the military officially didn't acknowledge. could protect colleagues who had no idea what was coming for them. The attack began at 0347 hours on a Thursday morning when most of Forward Operating Base Sentinel's personnel were asleep in their bunks, dreaming of home or counting down the days until their deployments ended. The first indication of trouble came through the base's perimeter sensors, electronic tripwires that detected movement in the rocky terrain surrounding the facility. But these early warnings were dismissed by the night watch as false alarms triggered by local wildlife, a common occurrence in the mountainous region where curious animals frequently wandered close enough to the base to activate security systems. Sergeant Mark Davidson, who was manning the command center during the pre-dawn hours, had seen dozens of similar alerts during his 6 months at Sentinel. Deer, wild boar, and occasionally bears would approach the perimeter fence while foraging for food, setting off sensors that required investigation but rarely indicated genuine threats. Davidson had dispatched a 2-man patrol to check the affected area, standard procedure that usually resulted in finding nothing more dangerous than animal tracks in the dust. The patrol never reported back. At 0352, automatic weapons fire erupted from the eastern approach to the base, muzzle flashes throbbing in the darkness like deadly fireworks. The sound shattered the pre-dawn quiet with the distinctive chatter of AK-47s and heavier machine guns, indicating a coordinated assault by well-armed, hostile forces who'd managed to approach Sentinel's defenses without detection. Within seconds, the base's alarm system was wailing across the compound, emergency lights flooding the area with harsh illumination that turned the night into a surreal landscape of stark shadows and blinding brightness. Captain Sarah Mitchell, the base commander, had been jolted awake by the first shots and was already pulling on her uniform when her communications officer burst through her door without knocking. "Ma'am, we're under attack," the young lieutenant reported breathlessly. "Multiple hostiles approaching from the east. The perimeter patrol isn't responding to radio calls." Mitchell's mind shifted immediately into crisis mode, the mental transition that separated professional military officers from civilians who couldn't function under extreme pressure. She'd commanded Sentinel for 14 months without experiencing direct combat, but her training at the Command and General Staff College had prepared her for exactly this scenario. The base's defensive plans had been rehearsed monthly, with every soldier knowing their assigned positions and responsibilities during enemy contact. "Sound general quarters," Mitchell ordered, strapping on her body armor as she spoke. "Get everyone to their defensive positions. Contact regional command and request immediate air support." But even as Mitchell issued these commands, she understood that Sentinel faced challenges that hadn't been anticipated in their defensive planning. The base had been designed as a logistics hub rather than a combat outpost, with defensive preparations focused on deterring opportunistic attacks rather than withstanding sustained assault by organized military forces. The personnel assigned to Sentinel were primarily support specialists and administrative staff, soldiers whose combat training had been limited to basic defensive tactics rather than the advanced infantry skills required for prolonged fighting. Hostile forces attacking the base demonstrated tactical sophistication that exceeded typical insurgent capabilities. Instead of launching a direct frontal assault that would expose them to Sentinel's defensive fire, they'd positioned snipers in the rocky hills overlooking the compound, establishing overwatch positions that could engage any defender who attempted to reach the perimeter fighting positions. These enemy marksmen had clearly conducted detailed reconnaissance of the base, identifying fields of fire and dead space with the precision of professional military personnel. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who commanded Sentinel's small security detachment, had attempted to organize a defensive response using the conventional tactics that his infantry training had emphasized. But every time his soldiers tried to reach their assigned positions along the perimeter wall, rifle fire from the surrounding hills forced them back into cover. The enemy snipers had created a deadly crossfire that made movement across open areas of the base essentially impossible. trapping the defenders in a handful of reinforced buildings that provided protection, but limited their ability to return. Effective fire. "I need suppressive fire on those ridge positions," Rodriguez radioed to Mitchell from his position behind the motor pool building. "My people can't get to the defensive positions with those shooters keeping us pinned down." Mitchell understood Rodriguez's tactical problem, but Sentinel lacked the heavy weapons necessary to engage targets at the ranges involved. The base's defensive arsenal consisted primarily of small arms and a few crew-served weapons that were effective against close-range threats, but couldn't reach enemy positions, located more than 800 meters away in the surrounding hills. The hostile snipers had positioned themselves beyond the effective range of most weapons available to Sentinel's defenders, creating a standoff where they could engage the base with impunity while remaining protected from retaliation. The situation deteriorated rapidly as enemy mortar rounds began falling within the compound. Expertly targeted explosions that demonstrated the attackers' familiarity with Sentinel's layout and infrastructure. The communications building took a direct hit that severed the base's primary connection to regional command, cutting off requests for air support and reinforcement. The generator facility was damaged by shrapnel that knocked out backup power systems, forcing critical equipment to operate on battery power that would be exhausted within hours. Elena had been awakened by the first gunfire and was already dressed and moving toward her assigned defensive position when the mortar attack began. Her official duties during base defense called for her to remain in the armory and ensure that weapons and ammunition were available for distribution to personnel who might need additional firepower. But as she made her way across the compound, Elena could see that conventional defensive tactics were failing catastrophically. Soldiers who'd trained extensively in urban combat and close-quarters fighting found themselves helpless against enemy snipers who could engage them from distances that exceeded their weapons' effective range. The defenders were equipped with standard infantry rifles optimized for engagements at 300 meters or less, while their attackers were employing precision weapons capable of accurate fire at 3 times that distance. The technological and tactical mismatch was creating a massacre that would result in total defeat unless something changed dramatically. Elena reached the armory and began the process of distributing additional ammunition and backup weapons to soldiers who were already discovering that their existing equipment was inadequate for the fight they were facing. But as she worked, she could hear radio communications that painted an increasingly desperate picture of Sentinel's defensive situation. "Bravo team is pinned down in Building 7, came one transmission. "We've got wounded who need evacuation, but every time we try to move them, sniper fire drives us back into cover." "Alpha team can't reach the communications array," reported another voice. "There's at least 3 shooters on the eastern ridge, and they've got clear fields of fire across the entire compound." Elena listened to these reports while mechanically loading magazines and checking weapon systems, but her mind was processing tactical information that her official job description didn't require her to understand. She was visualizing the battle from both perspectives, mapping enemy positions based on the defensive reports she was monitoring, calculating ranges and angles of fire that would be necessary to neutralize the hostile snipers who were systematically destroying Sentinels' ability to function. The enemy marksmen had chosen their positions with professional competence that exceeded typical insurgent capabilities. They'd established interlocking fields of fire that covered all approaches to critical base infrastructure, while positioning themselves in locations that provided excellent concealment and multiple escape routes. The tactical situation they'd created would require counter-sniper operations by personnel with specialized training and equipment that Sentinel's defenders didn't possess. Captain Mitchell's voice came over the radio with the strained control of someone trying to maintain command authority while confronting the reality of impending defeat. "All stations, this is Base Command. Air support has been delayed indefinitely due to weather conditions at the regional airfield. We're on our own until further notice. Elena understood immediately that this announcement represented a death sentence for everyone at Sentinel unless someone took action that fell outside the parameters of conventional base defense. The hostile snipers would systematically eliminate any defender who attempted to reach an effective firing position, while mortar fire would gradually destroy the buildings where the remaining personnel were sheltering. Without air support or reinforcement, the base would be overrun within hours. She also understood that she possessed capabilities that could change the tactical situation completely, but using those capabilities would require her to abandon the carefully maintained anonymity that had protected her for months. Elena would have to reveal skills that her official record insisted she didn't possess, exposing herself to questions about her background that she couldn't answer without compromising operations that extended far beyond her. Individual assignment, preparing, and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Elena stood in the armory surrounded by weapons that other soldiers couldn't use effectively at the ranges, required to save their lives, listening to radio reports that documented the systematic destruction of everything she'd been sent to Sentinel to protect. The choice before her was simple in its brutality: maintain her cover and watch her colleagues die, or reveal her true capabilities and accept the consequences that exposure would bring. In her foot locker, beneath the innocuous personal items that supported her fabricated identity, Elena kept equipment that officially didn't exist. A custom rifle that had never appeared on any inventory list, ammunition loaded to specifications that no standard manual contained, and accessories that enabled precision shooting under conditions that would defeat conventional marksmen. Elena Vasquez had spent months being invisible, letting others assume she was nothing more than a competent technician, whose contributions to military operations could be safely ignored. But invisibility, she was about to discover, was a luxury that soldiers couldn't afford when their friends were dying, and conventional weapons couldn't reach the people who were killing them. The time for hiding was over, and Elena was about to become visible in ways that would change everything. Elena moved through the armory with deliberate precision, her hands steady despite the chaos erupting around the base as mortar rounds continued to fall and automatic weapons fire echoed from the perimeter. She knelt beside her foot locker and entered the combination that unlocked the false bottom she'd installed during her first week at Sentinel, revealing equipment that existed nowhere in the base's official inventory records. The rifle that emerged from its concealed compartment bore no resemblance to the standard weapons that filled the armory's racks. Where military-issue sniper systems were designed for reliability and mass production, this weapon had been crafted for absolute precision by specialists whose names appeared in no public directories. Every component had been hand-selected and modified to tolerances that exceeded factory specifications by orders of magnitude. The stock had been custom-fitted to Elena's physical dimensions. The barrel had been stress-relieved using techniques that took weeks to complete, and the trigger mechanism had been adjusted to brake at exactly 2 pounds of pressure with no perceptible creep or over-travel. Elena assembled the weapon with movements so practiced they seemed automatic, her muscle memory guiding each action, while her conscious mind processed the tactical situation developing outside. The scope that crowned the rifle was a masterpiece of optical engineering, capable of resolving targets at distances that would render conventional optics useless. But more than its technical capabilities, the scope had been zeroed specifically for Elena's shooting style and visual characteristics, calibrated through thousands of rounds fired under every conceivable condition. The ammunition she selected from her hidden cache represented years of development work by ballisticians who understood that precision shooting at extreme ranges required projectiles designed for specific atmospheric conditions and barrel characteristics. Each cartridge had been loaded individually, with powder charges measured to 10th grain accuracy in bullets, sorted by weight to eliminate the variability that made long-range shooting unpredictable with factory ammunition. As Elena loaded the magazine with 20 rounds of this specialized ammunition, she could hear Captain Mitchell's increasingly desperate radio transmissions, attempting to coordinate a defense with weapons and personnel inadequate for the tactical situation they faced. 3 more soldiers had been wounded trying to reach defensive positions, and the enemy mortar fire was systematically destroying the base's infrastructure with the methodical precision of professionals who understood how to render military facilities inoperable. Elena shouldered her weapon and moved toward the armory's rear exit, which provided access to a maintenance ladder that led to the building's roof. The route would expose her to enemy observation, but it was the only way to reach a firing position with clear sightlines to the ridge positions, where the hostile snipers had established their overwatch. She paused at the door, understanding. At the moment she stepped outside with her rifle, questions about her background would become irrelevant compared to the reality of what she could accomplish with it. The ladder rungs were slick with morning condensation, but Elena climbed with the fluid economy of motion that marked professional soldiers who'd learned to move efficiently under fire. She could hear bullet impacts against the armory's walls as enemy snipers detected her movement and attempted to engage her before she could reach a stable firing position. But their shots were hasty and poorly aimed, fired by marksmen who'd grown careless after hours of engaging targets that couldn't effectively return fire. The armory roof provided Elena with an elevated platform that offered clear visibility across the entire compound and into the surrounding hills where the enemy had positioned their overwatch teams. Through her scope, she could see the muzzle flashes that revealed their locations with each shot they fired at Sentinel's defenders. The hostile snipers had chosen excellent positions for engaging targets within the base, but they'd failed to consider how their firing signatures would appear to someone equipped with optics, capable of resolving details at extreme range. Elena's first target was positioned behind a cluster of boulders approximately 850 meters northeast of the base, using a natural rock formation to conceal his profile while maintaining a clear field of fire across Sentinel's motor pool area. The enemy marksman was engaging Sergeant Rodriguez's security team with disciplined single shots, taking time to aim carefully between rounds in the manner of someone confident that his targets couldn't reach him with return fire. Elena settled into her shooting position with the practiced routine she'd perfected during years of training that officially had never occurred. Her breathing slowed to the controlled rhythm that professional snipers use to minimize physiological disturbances that could affect bullet trajectory. Her trigger finger found the familiar curve of the weapon's release mechanism, applying pressure so gradually that the shot's timing would be determined by her respiratory cycle. Rather than conscious decision, the rifle's report was sharp and clean, its sound distinct from the chaotic gunfire that had been echoing across the compound for the past hour. 850 meters away, the enemy sniper dropped from his position behind the boulder cluster, eliminated by a bullet that had struck him center mass with the finality that marked precision shooting by someone who understood exactly how to place projectiles where they would have maximum effect. Elena was already shifting to her second target before the first hostile had finished falling, her scope tracking across the rocky terrain to locate the muzzle flash she'd spotted earlier from a ridge position southwest of the base. This shooter had been engaging the communications building with harassing fire designed to prevent repair crews from restoring Sentinel's connection to regional command. The range was slightly longer, approximately 920 meters, and the target was partially concealed behind vegetation that would complicate shot placement. But Elena had made more difficult shots under worse conditions, and the fundamentals of precision marksmanship remained constant regardless of range or environmental factors. She calculated wind deflection based on mirage patterns visible through her scope, adjusted her point of aim to compensate for the target's elevation relative to her firing position, and controlled her breathing to ensure that her shot would break during the natural pause between heartbeats. The second shot eliminated the second sniper with the same clinical efficiency as the first, demonstrating capabilities that exceeded anything Sentinel's defenders had imagined possible. Elena continued her systematic engagement of enemy positions, identifying targets through patient observation and eliminating them with single shots that seemed to defy the laws of physics governing bullet trajectory and accuracy. Radio communications from across the base began to reflect the changing tactical situation as enemy sniper fire decreased and Sentinel's defenders found themselves able to move between positions without being immediately engaged by precision rifle fire. "I don't understand what's happening," Rodriguez's voice crackled over the emergency frequency. "The sniper fire from the eastern positions has stopped completely." Captain Mitchell's response carried the bewilderment of someone trying to comprehend tactical developments that exceeded her experience with conventional military operations. "Confirm that enemy sniper activity has ceased in your sector," she transmitted. "Are you taking any incoming fire at this time?" "Negative, Base Command," Rodriguez replied. "No sniper activity for the past 10 minutes. My teams are able to reach their assigned positions." Elena continued to work through the target list she'd compiled from her observation of enemy firing positions, eliminating hostile marksmen with shots that seemed impossible to the soldiers watching from below. Each engagement required calculations that accounted for distance, wind speed and direction, temperature and humidity variations, and the ballistic characteristics of ammunition that had been specifically designed for precision shooting under extreme conditions. The enemy mortar team had positioned their weapon in a natural depression approximately 1,200 meters south of the base, using terrain features to conceal their location while maintaining the ability to engage targets throughout Sentinel's compound. Elena could see the crew through her scope as they prepared to fire another barrage, their movements revealing their position despite the camouflage they'd used to conceal their equipment. At 1,200 meters, the shot would test the absolute limits of her weapon system's capabilities, requiring precision that exceeded what most military marksmen would attempt under ideal conditions. But Elena had trained for exactly these scenarios, developing skills that enabled her to engage targets at ranges where conventional snipers would consider success a matter of luck rather than professional competence. She adjusted her scopes. Elevation turret to compensate for the extreme range, calculated wind deflection based on environmental conditions that varied between her position and the target area, and settled into the shooting position that would provide maximum stability for the extended period required to ensure perfect shot placement. The bullet's flight time at that range was nearly 2 seconds, long enough for Elena to track its trajectory through her scope and observe its impact on the target. The enemy mortar crew was eliminated by a single shot that struck their ammunition supply, creating a secondary explosion that destroyed their weapon system and confirmed their neutralization to observers throughout the base. Silence fell across Forward Operating Base Sentinel for the first time in over an hour, broken only by the crackling of fires started by enemy mortar rounds and the distant sound of surviving hostile forces withdrawing from positions they could no longer maintain effectively. Elena remained motionless on the armory roof, scanning the surrounding terrain through her scope to ensure that all enemy marksmen had been eliminated and that the immediate threat to the base had ended. Below her, soldiers began emerging from the buildings where they'd sheltered during the attack, their faces reflecting shock and confusion as they tried to understand how their desperate tactical situation had been resolved so completely and so suddenly. Captain Mitchell's voice came over the radio with the controlled relief of someone who'd expected to lose her command and most of her personnel to an attack that conventional defensive measures couldn't have defeated. "All stations, this is Base Command," Mitchell announced. "Enemy contact has ceased. Conduct damage assessment and casualty reports. Medical teams to assist with wounded personnel." But Elena could see that the questions about her identity and capabilities were already beginning, as soldiers pointed toward her position on the armory roof and spoke in hushed conversations about shooting they'd witnessed but couldn't explain. Master Sergeant Kellner was among the group gathering near the base of the building, his expression reflecting the realization that his investigation of Elena's background had become irrelevant compared to what she'd just demonstrated. Elena Vasquez had spent months hiding her true capabilities behind the facade of bureaucratic competence, allowing others to assume she was nothing more than a skilled technician whose contributions to military operations could be safely ignored. But the attack on Forward Operating Base Sentinel had created circumstances where concealment was no longer possible, where the choice between maintaining her cover and protecting her colleagues had forced her to reveal abilities that would change everything about how the military establishment understood her role in their operations. The secret that Elena had protected so carefully was now visible to everyone at Sentinel, and there would be no returning to the anonymity that had kept her safe. The first soldier to reach the armory roof was Technical Sergeant Kim, who climbed the maintenance ladder with the urgent determination of someone seeking answers to questions that defied rational explanation. He found Elena in the process of carefully securing her rifle, her movements deliberate and methodical as she performed the post-engagement procedures that professional snipers use to maintain their equipment after combat operations. Kim stopped at the roof's edge, staring at the weapon in Elena's hands with the expression of someone trying to reconcile contradictory information that his mind couldn't process. The rifle bore no resemblance to the standard-issue sniper systems that Kim had seen during his 12 years of military service. Its custom components and specialized accessories indicated capabilities that exceeded anything in Sentinel's official inventory, while its obvious use in the engagement they just witnessed suggested that Elena possessed skills that her personnel file insisted she didn't have. "How did you make those shots?" Kim asked, his voice carrying the bewilderment of someone whose fundamental assumptions about reality had been shattered. The longest engagement was over 1,200 meters. "That's impossible with standard equipment." Elena looked at Kim directly for the first time since he'd arrived on the roof, understanding that her months of careful concealment had ended permanently with the shots she'd fired to save the base. There was no plausible explanation for her performance that wouldn't require admitting capabilities that her official record denied. No way to deflect Kim's question without confirming that she'd been deliberately hiding her true qualifications. "The equipment isn't standard," Elena replied quietly, her tone carrying the resignation of someone who'd accepted that secrets could no longer be maintained. "And neither is my training." Before Kim could respond, the sound of boots on the ladder announced the arrival of additional personnel who'd climbed to the roof, seeking their own answers to the questions that Elena's performance had raised. Sergeant Rodriguez appeared first, followed by Captain Mitchell and Master Sergeant Kellner, each carrying expressions that reflected their struggle to understand how the woman they'd dismissed as a routine support specialist had demonstrated marksmanship skills that exceeded anything they'd encountered during their military careers. Mitchell approached Elena with the careful formality of a commander who understood that her previous assumptions about one of her subordinates had been catastrophically incorrect. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez," she began, using Elena's rank with emphasis that suggested she was reassessing everything she thought she knew about Elena's position within the base hierarchy. "I need an explanation for what just happened." Elena set down her rifle and faced the group of officers and NCOs who'd gathered around her, understanding that this moment would determine not only her future at Sentinel, but potentially her ability to continue the mission that had brought her to the base initially. The careful balance between operational security and personal safety that had guided her actions for months was no longer sustainable, forcing her to choose between complete honesty and explanations that would satisfy immediate questions while concealing broader truths. "My name is Elena Vasquez," she began, speaking with the controlled precision that marked military personnel delivering official testimony. But my service record contains information that was classified for operational security reasons. I've been assigned to Sentinel under cover that was designed to conceal capabilities relevant to regional security operations. The admission created a moment of absolute silence as the assembled personnel processed the implications of Elena's statement. Kellner's expression shifted from suspicion to shock as he realized that his investigation of Elena's background had been targeting someone whose actual qualifications were protected by classification levels that exceeded his security clearance. Rodriguez stared at Elena with the bewildered respect of someone who'd just discovered that a colleague he'd barely noticed possessed combat skills that surpassed his own. Mitchell's response reflected the professional flexibility that had earned her command of a forward operating base in hostile territory. Rather than focusing on the deception that Elena's assignment had required, she immediately began processing the tactical implications of having an operator with Elena's capabilities integrated into her command structure. "What is your actual military occupational specialty?" Mitchell asked, her tone indicating that she expected a complete and accurate answer. Elena hesitated briefly, understanding that her response would reveal information that had been protected by classification protocols designed to maintain operational security for programs that officially didn't exist. But the attack on Sentinel had created circumstances where those protocols were secondary to the immediate requirements of military command and control. "Scout Sniper Specialist with Advanced Precision Marksmanship Qualification," Elena replied. "I've completed specialized training in long-range interdiction and counter-sniper operations. My assignment to Sentinel was designed to provide regional security monitoring while maintaining cover through routine logistics duties." The technical language Elena used to describe her background carried implications that the experienced military personnel around her understood immediately. Advanced Precision Marksmanship Qualification was terminology associated with elite special operations units whose existence was rarely acknowledged in public forums. Long-range interdiction suggested capabilities that exceeded conventional military sniper training by significant margins. Regional security monitoring indicated mission parameters that extended far beyond the responsibilities of a forward operating base armorer. Kellner stepped forward with the expression of someone whose professional instincts had been validated in ways he'd never anticipated. "I knew something wasn't right about your record," he said, his tone reflecting grudging respect rather than the antagonism that had characterized their previous interactions. "Your capabilities were too advanced for your supposed background." Elena nodded, acknowledging Kellner's assessment without revealing the frustration his investigation had caused or the professional risks his harassment had created. "My cover assignment required maintaining performance levels consistent with my official qualifications," she explained. "But operational requirements sometimes demanded capabilities that exceeded those limitations." Rodriguez approached Elena with the deferential posture of someone seeking to understand expertise that far exceeded his own experience. "Those shots you made," he said, gesturing toward the ridge positions where Elena had eliminated the enemy snipers. "How long have you been trained to shoot like that?" The question touched on aspects of Elena's background that remained classified. Despite her partial revelation of her true assignment, her training had occurred at facilities that didn't appear on any public maps, under instructors whose service records were protected by security protocols that would remain in effect long after their deaths. The techniques she demonstrated during the engagement represented years of specialized instruction in capabilities that the military establishment preferred to neither acknowledge nor discuss. "Specialized training began approximately 8 years ago," Elena replied, providing information that was accurate but incomplete. "The program focused on precision shooting under extreme conditions and advanced fieldcraft for operations in denied areas." Kim, who'd been listening to this exchange with growing amazement, finally voiced the question that had been troubling him since he'd witnessed Elena's performance. Why were you assigned to equipment maintenance if you have those kinds of capabilities? Elena's answer revealed the strategic thinking that had guided her assignment to Sentinel and similar bases throughout her career. Maintenance duties provided perfect cover for monitoring regional threat developments while remaining invisible to hostile intelligence services. Someone cleaning weapons doesn't attract the attention that operational personnel receive. The logic behind Elena's cover assignment became clear to the assembled officers as they considered the advantages of placing elite capabilities in positions where they wouldn't be expected or recognized. An armorer with advanced combat skills could observe and analyze threats while remaining protected by the assumption that support personnel posed no operational significance to enemy forces. Mitchell's military training enabled her to understand immediately how Elena's true capabilities could be integrated into Sentinel's defensive planning. Your real qualifications change our tactical situation significantly, she observed. We need to discuss how to incorporate your abilities into our operational planning. But Elena understood that Mitchell's pragmatic approach to command integration represented only one aspect of the transformation that her revelation had created. The soldiers around her were looking at her with expressions that reflected their adjustment to completely revised understanding of her role within their military community. Where they'd previously seen a competent but unremarkable support specialist, they now recognized someone whose combat capabilities exceeded their own by substantial margins. The change in their perceptions was visible in their body, language, and speech patterns as they processed the reality of Elena's true qualifications. Rodriguez straightened unconsciously when addressing her, adopting the more formal posture that military personnel used when interacting with superior specialists. Kim's questions became more deferential, reflecting his recognition that Elena possessed knowledge that far exceeded his own understanding of weapon systems and their capabilities. Even Kellner's attitude had transformed completely. His previous antagonism replaced by professional respect for someone whose abilities he'd suspected but never been able to confirm. His investigation had been vindicated in ways that exceeded his expectations, revealing not misconduct or deception, but operational excellence that had been concealed for legitimate security reasons. The immediate aftermath of Elena's revelation created a period of adjustment as everyone at Sentinel recalibrated their understanding of her role within the base's social and military hierarchy. Conversations that had excluded her were suddenly seeking her input. Assignments that had relegated her to secondary importance were being reconsidered in light of her actual capabilities. The isolation that Kellner's investigation had created was replaced by recognition that Elena's expertise could be vital to their survival in an increasingly dangerous operational environment. Elena watched this transformation with mixed emotions, understanding that her months of anonymity and safety had ended, but recognizing that her true capabilities could now be used openly to protect colleagues who no longer questioned her right to be among them. The careful balance she'd maintained between competence and invisibility was no longer necessary, but it was also no longer possible. The woman who'd cleaned weapons while hiding her identity as one of the military's most capable precision marksmen had become visible in ways that would reshape not only her own future, but the entire operational dynamic of Forward Operating Base Sentinel. 3 months later, Forward Operating Base Sentinel had been transformed into a regional training center for advanced marksmanship, with Elena leading programs that officially didn't exist but were reshaping how the military approached precision shooting operations. The quiet woman who'd once cleaned rifles in anonymity now commanded respect from elite operators who traveled from across the globe to learn techniques that had saved countless lives in impossible situations. Captain Mitchell had received her promotion to major, citing exceptional leadership during the base defense that had become a case study in asymmetric warfare tactics. Master Sergeant Kellner now served as Elena's administrative liaison, his investigative instincts redirected toward identifying other personnel whose capabilities might be hidden within routine assignments. Technical Sergeant Kim had requested transfer to Elena's program, understanding that proximity to such expertise could transform his own career trajectory. But Elena's greatest impact came through the soldiers she'd inspired to push beyond the limitations others had placed on them. Women throughout the military began requesting sniper training, no longer accepting that certain roles were beyond their capabilities. Support specialists started questioning whether their current assignments fully utilized their potential. The barriers that had once seemed permanent began cracking under pressure from people who'd heard Elena's story and realized that extraordinary abilities could emerge from the most unexpected places. Elena Vasquez had proven that legends aren't born from recognition or publicity, but from the moment when someone steps forward to do what others cannot, regardless of the personal cost. Her legacy lived not in medals or commendations, but in every precise shot that brought soldiers home safely, every barrier broken by someone who refused to accept limitations. Stories like Elena's remind us that greatness often hides in plain sight, waiting for circumstances that demand its revelation. If this incredible journey inspired you, hit that subscribe button and join our community where we uncover the extraordinary people living ordinary lives until the moment they're called to be heroes. What amazing story should we explore next? Let us know in the comments below.